Okay, so for this guide on how to service the fork oil on the KLX250, you're going to need the following equipment. Here's some kerosene. This is for flushing the forks out. It's not required, but I highly recommend it. Got some contact cleaner just for cleaning the oil off of the fork cap, off of the springs and that, without leaving the residue that a degreaser would use. We've got some fresh oil, obviously. Got a fork spring holder. Now, if you don't have one of these, you can just use a wrench. A 19mm spanner would probably do the trick. We've got a ruler for measuring the fork oil height. We've got the fork oil level gauge. Now, what this is, it's basically just a syringe with a straight piece of metal tubing. And what you do is you measure the distance from the top of the fork down to where the oil is, so you can suck out any excess. Planet KLX recommends about 97mm. The manual recommends 101mm. I've measured 100 mils, and I've marked it with some tape just so it's going to be easier to see and to suck out the excess oil. We've got a 12mm T-bar wrench for undoing the clamps so we can take the fork out. We've got a 13mm fork cap wrench to undo the fork cap. Got a 17mm spanner to hold the nut on the fork rod so that we can then undo the fork cap to take the spring off. I've also got some string because I don't have a fork rod puller. I'll show you how to use that a bit later. Okay, so now we are ready to try and remove the fork leg. I've already removed the front wheel and the fork guard, so that I have got quick access to be able to just pull the fork leg off. Now what you're going to want to do is undo the top clamp bolts a reasonable amount before you then try and crack open the fork plug. Now you want to try and do this whilst the fork's still in the triple clamps, so the triple clamps hold the fork nicely for you. Now I've already broken the fork cap. I actually had to use a rubber mallet because it was that tight. I've got it loose enough now, so then what we do, we loosen the bottom clamp bolt and we should be ready to actually remove the fork leg with a little bit of twisting. No, it's not working. Okay, so a little trick here, just to get the fork leg moving, using the T-bar wrench, putting it on top of the fork cap and a rubber mallet to smack it down a little bit. And that should make it a bit easier to not stop. Okay, the bottom clamp actually holds it quite tight, so what I'll do is I'll actually remove the clamp bolt altogether and then get a flathead screwdriver, stick it in this gap just to push the clamp open a bit so the fork comes out, and that's actually going to make it easier for reinstalling the fork later as well. So I'm just going to leave that in there for now. So we've got the fork out, we're ready to roll. Right, now what you want to do is remove the fork cap altogether. And once it's released, you'll find that the outer leg will just slide down, so we slide it all the way down. By the way, you want to have cleaned the fork leg as much as possible before you do this, so that you don't damage the seal, because we're not replacing the seal here. Now what you're supposed to do is push the spring down and put your fork spring holder in to hold it, so that you can then get access to that nut to then open the fork cap so you can remove the spring. Now my spring is way too strong for that, So all I'm going to do is try and get my wrench in between the spring coils to hold the nut, then use my cap wrench to undo it. Once it's broken, you can then just unscrew it by hand. Put the cap on something clean, and then you can remove the spring. Now make sure you put the spring the same way up, so when you reinstall it you're not going to get mistaken. And you can see that that rod inside there just sinks down. So now that the spring's off, we want to empty the old oil into a container. As you can see, it is not pretty. Now what I want to do is actually leave the fork upside down here for a while, so all the oil drains out, or as much of the oil as possible drains out. You can see it's got a syrupy feel to it, coming out very slowly, which means that the oil is not flowing very well inside the valves there. You might want to just move the rod as well, pull it out to get as much oil out as possible on the first run, push it back in, then come out again to see all that mucky oil coming out. I did not realize how bad, how dirty the oil got in there. I thought it was a nice clean closed environment. I was wrong. Okay, so given that the oil is so dirty and syrupy, I've decided that what I want to do is actually flush it out with kerosene. I don't know if this is recommended or not, but I figured kerosene can't do too much harm, and yeah, it'll protect the rubbers and what have you, rather than using thinners or something. So we'll do that next. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pour some kerosene into the fork so I can flush it out. And then what I'll do is I'll move the rod up and down a little bit to try and get the kerosene flowing through the rod, through the valve port, past the shims. Pump it a few times. As you can see, I'm making a bit of a mess. Okay, and now we'll pour the fluid out again. You can see, even when it's been flushed, it's still dirty. So I'll pour the fluid out, and then I'll pump the rod up and down again. Whoop, a bit too vigorous. Try and get that kerosene out of the rod. Okay. Now, given how dirty that kerosene is still, I think I'm going to give it another flush. See how we go with that. Okay, I've flushed it out again, and so after the second flush, this is what the kerosene looks like. Cleaner, but still dirty. So there's actually a lot more muck inside there than you realise probably. Now what we'll do is we'll leave this fork upside down to let the kerosene drain out as much as possible for a while, and I'll leave it probably 10-15 minutes to see how that goes before we go about the refreshing the oil bit. Just as a matter of interest, off camera I gave it a third flush, and look how dirty it still comes out. So probably give it 4 or 5 flushes if you can. I'll do it a few more times, there's no need for me to record it though. Okay, so now the next step is we've finished draining the kerosene out of the fork. Now it's time to put fresh fork oil in. Now the manual says put 450 mils of fork oil in. Don't get too hung up on that. Basically what you want to do is you want to fill it up until it hits about where the nut is. So it'll actually take quite a lot more than 450 mils of oil. The reason for that is what we're going to do is use the method of fork oil height, which is a far better way of measuring how much oil you've got in the fork. So I've finished that bottle. What you want to do is once you've poured the oil in, slowly move the rod up and down. And you hear it bubbling, and what it's doing is it's actually filling the fork rod with oil. And you'll notice when you do this that the fork oil height inside there that you just poured in has gone down significantly. So now we fill it up again more or less to where the nut is, so you can actually see the oil. There we go. And pump the rod up and down again. Now the manual says do this 10 times. I'd recommend it doing at least 10 times until you can't feel or hear any more bubbles, and the resistance as you're pulling it up is pretty much constant. And you can feel as that fork rod fills, it gets more and more difficult. There's more and more resistance. Now, oil height's gone down a bit again. So I'm going to top it up again. Not a hell of a lot, but still, we don't want any air in here. Okay, now I'll do this a few more times, but just for the purposes of speeding this video up, what we do now is we get our fork oil height tool, and as I said, I've put a bit of tape on here so it's exactly 100 mils, and what we do is we insert that. The outer leg is down as far as it can go. We insert that fork oil height tool to there, and then try and suck up excess oil. Now my syringe is a bit old and the rubber's not so good, so I'm going to have to do this several times. What you want to do is suck oil until it actually sucks air. Then you know that the air gap in your fork is 100 mils or however many mils you've measured, and you've got the right amount of oil in there. You don't have to worry about the exact measurement of 450 mils or whatever, which is probably not going to be all that accurate because you don't know what fluids and airs are in there. So as you can see, as you would have heard there, it actually sucked a little bit of air, so there we go. Fork oil height is now correct. So put the fork oil tool aside, and we are now ready to reinstall the spring and yeah, start finalizing up this job. Okay, so now it's time to reinstall the spring. Now this is where that piece of string I mentioned earlier on comes into play. What you basically want to do is put some kind of weight on the end of the string and feed it down through the center of the spring. So there you go. And take the weight off. So in this case I've used a little bolt. Just makes it easier than trying to feed it through. Now I've made a bit of a loop on at the end of the string, and what we're going to do with that loop is, I can get to the fork properly without tangling myself up on the spring, is we're going to put that loop around the end of the rod, because I don't have a rod puller. This is what happens when you're on a shoestring budget. And then what you can do is put the spring over the rod end, pulling the slack up on the string, and then slide the spring down inside and slowly pull on a piece of string so that the rod end, complication here, so that the rod comes up now. There's a lot of resistance as it comes up, but it goes down fairly quickly. So what we want to do, pull that rod up through the center of the spring, until it reaches the top. Now it won't go all the way up. Put your thumb in just to hold the rod there. Try and pull the piece of string out. We now have the fork rod up there. Now what's happened is that nut has actually come a little bit loose, so it's going to hand tighten it down a little bit. Now what we do is we try and put our number 17, I think it is, yeah, number 17 spanner back on the nut to hold it whilst we get our cap wrench and we tighten it up. So once you've got the rod to the top, what you can do is you can stick your number 17 spanner in so it holds the nut, remove the piece of string, and now you can hand screw the fork cap on. So it reaches the nut, and now we can tweak it with our fork cap spanner so it's reasonably tight, but don't over tighten it. Now we can pull our spanner out, and there we go. We are approaching the end. So what we do now is we pull out the fork outside up to the cap, and we can do up the fork cap. Now I've got oily hands, so I can't over tighten, but you don't want to make that too tight because there is actually an O-ring there which makes a nice seal. if you want to, when the fork is back on the bike in the clamps, you can tighten that a little more just to make sure that it's good. But otherwise, we are ready to install the fork back into the triple clamp. So let's get to that. Right, now remember earlier on, I put the flat bladed screwdriver into that gap in the clamp and just hammered it in lightly with a mallet. So what happens now is it's a lot easier for us to just slide the fork back up into the clamps. And as I mentioned, I'm going to mount the clamp flush with the top there, and I'll remove the screwdriver, and that on its own is actually enough to hold the fork in place. Now I'm just making sure that the fork level is pretty much the same both sides, which it is. So now we can tighten up the bolts. Now tighten the bottom one first, and the reason for that is because we're going to just tweak the top, the fork cap again to make sure that it's tight enough. Don't want to over tighten it and strip threads. Now that the fork's being held nicely in the clamp, we can just put our wrench back on again and just tweak it just lightly, not over tightening it, so that fork cap is now secure again. Now we tighten up the clamp at the top. Again, don't over tighten it, you don't want to strip your threads because then you've got problems on your hands, but reasonably tight so the forks aren't going to come up when you're out on your ride. And I'd say that that's pretty much it. Now what you want to do is put your fork guards back on and refit the front wheel, pump the front brakes a bit so that your brake pads go back into place properly, and you're ready to ride with your nice fresh oil in the forks.